collective action into the exercise of institutional power with individual needs and citizen participation. In our present time of significant anti-government sentiment, with a regular onslaught of attacks on the regulatory state from the conservative political right, it's important to study more closely the ways that Nader and his allies contributed, from the left, to the crucial political shift in attitudes toward government during the 1960s and 1970s. It's also worth revisiting these critiques of government as the country debates renewed appeals for increased federal investment in regulation, harking back to the New Deal, to address the pressing challenges of climate change, economic inequality, and lack of opportunity. The heyday of Nader's influence coincided with the 15 years during which the United States turned from the Great Society liberalism to Ronald Reagan's conservative revolution. In the mid-1960s, Lyndon Johnson was at the height of his power, laying the foundation for Medicare and Medicaid, and for civil and voting rights. During that period stretching from Johnson to Reagan, the United States established an extensive new regulatory regime to protect health, safety, and the environment. During those same years, Nader and other advocates created a robust nonprofit sector to protect a public interest that the government, they argued, did not reliably serve. Under pressure from both the left and the right, the traditional liberal establishment fell into disarray. By 1980, the Reagan Revolution was whipping the country in a different direction, touting so-called free markets, and questioning whether the government had any productive role to play. Reagan declared the end of the liberal state and set his sights on curtailing the role of the federal government. In the decades following Reagan's election, American politics have grown ever more starkly polarized along partisan lines around the role of government in American life. Popular narratives emphasize the standoff between left and right, conservative critics of big government clashing with the federal government's liberal defenders. On environmental policy, a bitter stalemate ensued after 1980. Conservatives sought to cut environmental enforcement and limit federal regulation. Liberals struggled to protect the foundational environmental laws of the 1970s, including laws protecting clean air and clean water. During these recent decades of strife, federal environmental protections largely endured against conservative attack. At the same time, relatively little new environmental legislation passed through Congress. Notable exceptions include clean air legislation in 1990 and a 2016 chemical safety bill. As this partisan conflict over governance has deepened, Nader and the broader left-wing critique of government, so vital to 1970s political reforms and environmental legislation, have slipped from historical accounts. We have lost touch with how the struggles of the late 1960s and 1970s destabilized the old framework for business and government, predating many conservative attacks, yet failed to provide a coherent and politically viable replacement. Historians of conservatism have recently portrayed the political battles of the 1970s in terms of a clash between pro-regulation liberals and anti-government, market-oriented businessmen, suburbanites, and religious conservatives. Conservative anti-government sentiment, according to this interpretation, culminated in Ronald Reagan's famous 1981 declaration that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. In this historical narrative, the environmental, health, and safety regulation of the early 1970s fits easily into modern liberalism. The environmental movement, with its wave of 1970s legislative victories, represents a final extension of the modern activist state, which conservatives and Reaganism rejected. These interpretations fail to explain why the New Deal regulatory state became so vulnerable to conservative critique, what parts liberals and the left played in its demise, and why liberals struggled to create a coherent alternative to market-oriented conservatism. My goal in this book is to address this gap by mapping the more complex and bipartisan origins of American assaults on government power. During this era, how did the government go from being the solution for society's ills to being the cause of its problems? Understanding why and how public confidence in government declined requires a closer analysis of the rise of citizen activists like Nader and the nonprofit sector as an alternative to government. Undermining government's role surely